The end of globalization is truly happening now. For decades, the world operated within the same geopolitical architecture, built after the war to guarantee stability, growth, and predictability. This arrangement shaped alliances, defined economic flows, and established rules that influenced everything from energy prices to how countries relate to each other. Today, however, clear signs indicate that this structure is being reconfigured. Tensions between major powers, changes in the role of the dollar, disputes over sovereignty, technology, and security show that we are living through a moment of transition, not just another isolated crisis. Understanding this scenario has ceased to be an academic exercise and has become a necessity for understanding political decisions, economic impacts, and global risks that directly affect the United States and the rest of the world. In this video, we will organize the main elements of this transformation, explain who the central actors are, what interests are at stake, and how this change is happening, step by step. If you value serious and straightforward analysis of what's really happening in the world, please like and subscribe to the channel. This greatly strengthens the channel and helps me bring content that doesn't usually appear in traditional media. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Now let's understand this whole situation. Following the end of World War II, the planet found itself in a state of unprecedented material, economic, and human exhaustion. Major urban centers were destroyed, production systems had collapsed, and millions of people lived in food, political, and financial insecurity. In this context, it became evident that simple physical reconstruction would not be enough. It was necessary to create a new global architecture capable of preventing another conflict of similar scale, and at the same time, allowing national economies to recover in a coordinated manner. The answer found was the construction of an international system based on economic cooperation, monetary integration, and guarantees of collective security. Multilateral institutions emerged with the aim of stabilizing currencies, financing reconstruction, facilitating trade, and reducing incentives for direct wars between major powers. Over the following decades, this arrangement began to organize the world around complementary functions. Some regions specialized in industrial production, others in financing, others in consumption, while a central core assumed the role of guarantor of order and security for the system as a whole. The central objective was not to maximize absolute efficiency, but to create predictability, reduce uncertainty, and maintain sufficient political stability to enable economic growth. This logic shaped alliances, production chains, and strategic decisions for generations, establishing the foundation of the international order that many still recognize today. If this historical context makes sense to you, write the word origin in the comments to show that you have been following this analysis from the beginning. Over time, this global architecture began to operate through a mechanism less visible to the general public but absolutely central to its functioning. The currency adopted as an international reference became the axis of global trade, not only as a medium of exchange, but as an instrument of power. The possibility of buying energy, financing projects, and accessing international markets came to depend on the use of this currency and the acceptance of certain rules. Energy, in turn, ceased to be merely an economic resource and took on a strategic dimension, since guaranteeing its flow meant guaranteeing the functioning of modern economies. For all this to operate without major disruptions, a relatively stable security environment was necessary, capable of protecting trade routes, financial contracts, and governments aligned with the system. International financial institutions, central banks, and defense structures began to operate in an interconnected way, creating an ecosystem in which financial liquidity, monetary stability, and military security mutually reinforced each other. Access to this system was not automatic. It depended on adherence to clear rules, acceptance of certain economic standards, and a willingness to integrate into the existing order. For many countries, this meant unprecedented growth opportunities. For others, it implied limits to political and economic autonomy. Even so, for decades, this mechanism functioned in a relatively predictable way, supporting the expansion of international trade and the integration of markets on a global scale. The benefits of this model, however, were never distributed evenly. Large corporations, financial sectors, and countries able to adapt quickly to the new rules reaped significant gains. Markets expanded, international investments grew, and consumption increased in various parts of the world. At the same time, this financial growth did not automatically translate into widespread prosperity for all segments of the population. The pursuit of efficiency and cost reduction led to the transfer of factories, jobs, and entire production chains to regions where labor was cheaper. In core countries, this caused profound transformations in the labor market, with the weakening of traditional industrial sectors and the growth of service and finance-related activities. Communities that previously depended on local production began to face structural unemployment, wage stagnation, and greater inequality. In the United States, this process contributed to social and political tensions that accumulated over time. While macroeconomic indicators showed growth and stability, a significant portion of the population felt that the benefits of the system were not being distributed proportionally. This mismatch between global financial success and internal social impacts has created a structural tension that has long been ignored or treated as an inevitable side effect. If this part of the analysis helps you connect the global economy and social reality, comment on the word impact to reinforce this discussion. As economic integration progressed, the world became increasingly interdependent. Production chains began to cross continents, with components manufactured in various countries before reaching the final consumer. This model brought efficiency gains, cost reductions, and a greater variety of products. However, it also introduced significant weaknesses. Dependence on distant suppliers, complex logistics routes, and constant flows of energy and raw materials created vulnerabilities that only became fully visible during times of crisis. Disruptions at a specific point in the chain could generate cascading effects, affecting entire industries in other regions of the world. Countries that had outsourced a large part of their production discovered that economic efficiency does not always equate to strategic security. Excessive specialization reduced room for maneuver in emergency situations, whether due to regional conflicts, energy crises, or trade disputes. The system, which seemed highly efficient in times of stability, proved fragile in the face of unexpected shocks. This systemic risk, embedded in the very logic of extreme interdependence, became a central factor in discussions about economic security and national sovereignty. With the increase in these fragilities, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the existing order through coercion. Maintaining the system required, directly or indirectly, a willingness to intervene in conflicts, impose sanctions, or demonstrate military force to ensure compliance with the rules. This model implied high costs, both financial and political and social. Prolonged wars, external military operations, and constant diplomatic tensions began to generate internal wear and tear in the countries responsible for sustaining this structure. Furthermore, in a world where several powers possess nuclear weapons, the use of direct force has clear limits. Deterrence, which for decades functioned as an element of stability, began to lose effectiveness as the cost of escalation became unacceptable to all involved. A point was reached where the application of military power to preserve the existing order began to generate more instability than security. This exhaustion of the coercive model is one of the clearest signs that the old order faces structural limits that are difficult to overcome. If you perceive this change in the way power is exercised in the world, write the word limit in the comments. Given this scenario, the international system began to transform. Instead of a single center of decision-making and coordination, multiple poles of power emerged. Countries and groups of countries began to seek alternatives, forming regional alliances, parallel agreements, and their own mechanisms for economic and financial cooperation. The global consensus that marked the previous decades gave way to a growing fragmentation of political and economic authority. Different development models, payment systems, and security arrangements began to coexist, not always harmoniously. As a consequence, the structural demand for the currency that underpinned the original system began to gradually weaken, reflecting the search for greater autonomy and diversification. This movement does not represent an immediate collapse, but a complex transition to a multipolar world in which power, influence, and strategic decisions are distributed among various actors. Understanding this process is essential to understanding the challenges and opportunities presented in the current global scenario, especially for the United States, which remains a central actor, but now embedded in a much more competitive and dynamic environment. As the international order moves away from a centralized model, it becomes essential to understand who the actors are that today vie for real influence over global decisions. Unlike the recent past, there is no longer a single center of command capable of defining rules accepted by all. The current scenario is marked by the simultaneous presence of several centers of power, each with its own interests, distinct capabilities, and specific ways of operating. These groups do not operate in isolation, nor do they follow a clear hierarchy. They compete, cooperate occasionally, and in many cases, overlap. This dynamic explains why global decisions often seem fragmented or contradictory. Some of these centers exert influence through capital, others through state authority, others through technological dominance, and others through the ability to impose security or instability. None of them controls the system completely, but all influence its course. Understanding this multiplicity is fundamental to interpreting international events that, at first glance, seem disconnected, but which in practice are part of the same structural dispute for space, autonomy, and strategic advantage. This competition doesn't only occur between countries, but also between structures that cross borders. Large financial flows, global technology chains, security systems, and national political decisions constantly intersect. A movement in one of these centers generates reactions in the others, creating an environment of constant adjustment. The result is a world in which decisions are made less predictably, with flexible alliances and interests that change according to the context. For the American public, this helps explain why foreign policy, the economy, and even domestic decisions are increasingly connected to disputes that no longer follow the clear pattern of previous decades. If you are following this analysis and want to show that you understand who is vying for power today, write the word power in the comments. Within this set of forces, financial control plays a particularly relevant role. The power exercised through capital does not depend on physical borders or formal authority over territories. It manifests itself in the ability to direct investments, define which companies grow or shrink, and influence strategic decisions without the need for direct intervention. Those who control capital flows do not necessarily need to own the money. What matters is the ability to decide where it goes, how fast it moves, and under what conditions it circulates. This type of power is indirect, but extremely effective because it shapes the behavior of governments, companies, and even individuals. Organizations that manage large volumes of resources can influence entire markets, establish standards, and impose criteria that end up being followed globally. The absolute priority of this power center is to maintain liquid and readily available capital. Liquidity means the ability to transform assets into readily available resources without significant loss of value. Speed means reducing friction, regulatory barriers, and delays that could limit the circulation of money. In a fragmented world, with different rules in each country, this becomes an increasing challenge. Therefore, much of the recent financial innovation seeks to create systems that operate across national borders, allowing decisions to be executed almost instantaneously. This logic helps to understand why changes in the international financial system have a direct impact on local economies, jobs, and public policies. Even when these transformations seem technical or distant from everyday life, they affect how credit is granted, investments are made, and risks are distributed. For the United States, understanding this mechanism is essential, as the country remains deeply integrated into this system, even in a context of increasing competition. Alongside this transnational financial power, sovereign states remain central actors, but with increasingly diverse strategies. All countries see full integration into the global system as a desirable goal. For some, preserving internal control over resources, infrastructure, and political decisions is more important than accelerated economic growth. This choice involves clear costs, such as less access to foreign investment or slower growth, but also offers advantages, such as greater autonomy in times of crisis. The decision between integration and control is not ideological, but strategic, and reflects the history, geography, and priorities of each country. Technology permeates all these choices. It functions as a transversal tool, capable of amplifying the power of both financial actors and sovereign states. Digital systems allow for monitoring, coordination, and automation on an unprecedented scale. At the same time, Communication technologies, data, and artificial intelligence influence everything from the economy to national security. Countries and organizations that master these tools gain a competitive advantage, regardless of the political model they adopt. Technology does not replace traditional power, but enhances it, making decisions faster and having broader effects. To sustain this balance, security remains an essential layer. The ability to protect territories, critical infrastructure, and strategic flows remains relevant, even in an increasingly digital world. Strength, in this context, is not only military, but also institutional, economic, and technological. If this interaction between sovereignty, technology, and security makes sense to you, comment with the word sovereignty to strengthen this discussion. Given all these forces at play, it is important to understand that the world today is experiencing a transition, not a collapse. There is neither a total power vacuum nor widespread chaos. What exists is a gradual reorganization of the structures that sustained the previous order. Structural changes often generate uncertainty, but do not necessarily mean permanent instability. Throughout history, international systems have undergone similar transformations in which old balances gave way to new arrangements. The difference in the current scenario lies in the speed and complexity of these changes, driven by technology, economic interdependence, and instant communication. Public perception plays an important role in this process. Political narratives, media discourse, and emotional reactions amplify the feeling of crisis, even when institutional mechanisms continue to function. Understanding the difference between structural change and chaos helps to interpret news and events more clearly. Not all tension indicates an imminent conflict, and not every punctual rupture represents the end of the system. There are clear limits to what can or cannot happen, imposed by economic costs, risks of escalation, and shared interests among major actors. These limits act as brakes, even in a competitive environment. For the foreseeable future, this means that the global landscape will continue to be marked by adjustments, negotiations, and disputes, but within relatively controlled parameters. Countries, companies, and institutions are learning to operate in a less predictable world, in which flexibility and adaptation become essential. For the American public, understanding this transition is fundamental to evaluating political decisions, economic impacts, and the role of the United States in a system that no longer responds to the same rules as before. The challenge is not to predict every event, but to understand the structural forces that shape the possible path of the world in the coming years. What we've seen so far shows that the world is not collapsing, but going through a profound transition phase where power, influence, and strategic decisions are being redistributed. Understanding these movements is essential for interpreting news, conflicts, and alliances without falling into oversimplifications. If this content helped you see the global scenario more clearly, please subscribe to the channel, and if you've made it to the end, leave a comment. I'm paying attention. In the next video, which is already on screen, we'll analyze a new chapter in this global dispute. Khamenei disappears, China and the Revolutionary Guard unite against the US Army. I'll be waiting for you.